Harlem in 1928 is supposed to be Silk Stockings and the Cotton Club. Duke Ellington on the bandstand, white tourists in rooms that would not seat a single black patron. 3 blocks north, another Harlem was cooking. A dented brass percolator bubbled on a gas range in a Sugar Hill brownstone. The woman was Corrine Whitfield, a laundress cooking for 3 boarders between night shifts at the Tree of Hope. Every dish on this list passed through her kitchen that year. Number 8 was hog intestines, scrubbed 3 times and boiled for 3 hours. Number 1 came up from New Orleans and changed how Harlem ate on New Year's morning for 40 years. These 25 dishes were not nightclub food. They were rent party food, night shift food, and Sunday table food, cooked in kitchens the city pretended did not exist. Hit that subscribe button. Here are the 25 forgotten recipes. Number 25, neckbones and rice. Corrine paid 15 cents a pound for pork neckbones at the butcher on 135th Street. The meat was cheap because nobody downtown wanted it. Up in Harlem, it was supper. She dropped the bones into a pot of salted water with a split onion, let them simmer for 2 hours until the meat slid off the bone, then ladled the liquor over white rice. The rice drank up everything the pork gave. Her mother had done the same thing in Beaufort County back in 1895. Her grandmother had done it before that. Back then, a pot of neck bones and rice fed 4 grown men on a night shift for under 40 cents. The thing is, you do not forget that smell. It clung to the curtains. It clung to the stairwell. Neighbors knew what day it was by what was cooking 3 doors down. Simple food, powerful food, and the kind of supper that kept a working woman on her feet through a 12-hour laundry shift. Number 24, hot water cornbread. This was the bread of no oven. Corine's kitchenette had a 2-burner gas ring and nothing else. So she made bread in a cast iron skillet on the stovetop. Yellow cornmeal, a pinch of salt and boiling water poured straight over the meal until it tightened into a soft dough. She shaped it into small patties with wet hands and fried them in bacon drippings, saved from the morning. The outside turned crackling brown. The inside stayed soft as pudding. 3 cents worth of meal fed 5 people. Her grandmother taught her the water had to be rolling hot or the patties would fall apart in the grease. That detail had traveled up from the Carolinas with every cook who boarded the train north. Now here is what most people miss. Hot water cornbread was not a recipe. It was a solution. No oven, no milk, no eggs, no problem. Number 23, fried cornmeal mush. Leftover grits from Tuesday did not get thrown away in a Harlem kitchen. Ever. Corrine poured the thick mush into a loaf pan and left it on the fire escape overnight to set. By morning, it was firm enough to slice. She cut the loaf into thick slabs, dredged them in dry meal, and fried them in fatback grease until the edges went gold and lacy. A drizzle of cane syrup on top, and that was breakfast for 4. The whole plate cost maybe 6 cents. Her father had eaten the same breakfast on a tenant farm in Sumter County decades earlier. He called it yesterday's supper, showing up for work again. That is frugality passed down through 3 generations. The kind of cooking your grandmother did not write down because nobody thought to ask. Number 22, hoe cakes on the coal stove. A hoe cake was the oldest bread in African American cooking. Older than cornbread, older than biscuits. The name came from the field hands who baked them on the blade of a garden hoe held over open flame. In Corine's 4th floor kitchen, the hoe was a cast iron griddle, but the recipe had not changed in 150 years. Cornmeal, salt, lard, water, that was it. She mixed it thin, spooned it onto the hot griddle, and flipped it once. 2 minutes aside, a stack of 6 hoe cakes and a tin of molasses fed the whole household on a Sunday morning for under a dime. The old timers at the stoop said a hoe cake was the taste of every generation that came before you. Every single one of them had eaten the same bread. Number 21, crackling bread. Cracklings were the crispy bits of skin left over after rendering lard from fatback. Most Harlem cooks saved them in a jar by the stove. On a cold Saturday, Corrine would crumble a cup of cracklings into her cornbread batter, pour it into a greased skillet, and slide the whole thing into a neighbor's oven 2 flights down. The bread came back 20 minutes later, smelling like smoke and pork and warm butter. It was rich in a way store bread could never be. A wedge of crackling bread beside a bowl of greens was supper all by itself. Her mother in Orangeburg County had made it the exact same way in 1898. Passed down, traditional, the kind of bread that tasted like a memory even when you were eating it the first time. Number 20, salt pork hocks and cabbage. A whole head of green cabbage in 1928, Harlem cost 4 cents. A salt pork hock from the corner butcher cost another dime. That was 14 cents for a pot that fed 6 people. Corrine boiled the hock for an hour until the broth turned cloudy with salt and fat. Then she quartered the cabbage and dropped it in for 20 minutes more. The cabbage came out soft, silver, and swimming in the richest liquor you ever tasted. You sopped it up with cornbread. You did not need anything else. Her grandfather had eaten the same supper in the Low Country on Sundays after church. A century of the same dish, simmered in the same way by hands that had never tasted anything else. Back then, that was enough. Here's what working people knew. A pot of cabbage is a pot of peace. Number 19, sweet potato pone. A pone was not a pie. Pones had no crust. Corrine grated 3 sweet potatoes by hand, beat in 1 egg, a cup of cane syrup, a spoon of nutmeg, and a pour of evaporated milk. The whole mixture went into a buttered pan and baked in a neighbor's oven until the top went crackly brown. The inside stayed custardy, almost pudding. A slice of sweet potato pone at a rent party in 1928 sold for a nickel. The cooks made them by the dozen on Friday nights, and the pans were empty by midnight. Her aunt in Charleston had made pone for Sunday dinner as far back as Corrine could remember. Same grater, same pan, same sweet smell rolling down the hallway. That is the incredible thing about a recipe that never changed. It did not have to. Number 18, fried sweet potato slices. Imagine the cheapest side dish in all of Harlem. A single sweet potato cost 2 cents on 135th Street. Corrine peeled it, sliced it thin as a dime, and fried the rounds in bacon grease until the edges caramelized into a kind of crunchy candy. A sprinkle of salt, a shake of cinnamon, and that was a side that went with anything. Pork chops, chicken, neck bones, greens. The sweetness cut through the salt the way a singer cuts through a noisy room. It was beautiful cooking made from nothing. And here's the part that surprised me when I dug into the research. Fried sweet potato slices were not a southern dish transplanted. They were invented in the northern kitchens up in Harlem and Pittsburgh and Detroit by women who arrived with nothing but a cast iron pan and a memory of their mother's garden. They adapted. They made sweetness work in a kitchen 6 feet wide. Corrine taught the same trick to her landlady's daughter, a girl of 12 named Hazel, who was born in New York and had never seen a sweet potato pulled from red dirt. Hazel would cook them the same way for her own children in the 1950s and her grandchildren in the 1980s. That is how a recipe survives the war, the depression, and 2 generations of moving trucks. 1 cast iron pan, 1 thin slice, 1 cheap sweet potato that became a part of who the family was. Every time you smell that caramel edge coming up from the grease, you are standing in a chain that runs back to a laundress on Sugar Hill in 1928. That is not nostalgia. That is a working woman's gift to a century she would never see. Number 17, Geechee red rice in Harlem. Plenty of Harlem cooks had Gullah grandmothers back in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. They brought red rice up with them on the train. Corrine's friend Lula, a hairdresser on 137th Street, cooked it every Saturday in a black cast iron pot. Smoked bacon rendered first, then onion, green pepper, a crushed garlic clove. In went a cup of rice and 2 cups of tomato broth made from the cheap can of crushed tomatoes you could buy for 9 cents. Salt, a dash of red pepper, a tight lid, and 20 minutes on low heat. The rice came out brick red, glossy, each grain separate. Lula said you could hear Charleston in every spoonful. That is a migration told through a single pot. Back then, a quart of red rice fed 8 grown people after a long laundry shift. Number 16, boiled peanuts from the stoop. Green peanuts showed up on Harlem sidewalks every September, hauled north in burlap sacks from Virginia and the Carolinas. A pound cost 7 cents. Corrine boiled them in heavily salted water for 4 hours on a slow burner, sometimes overnight. The shells turned soft. The peanut inside went from dry to creamy like a tiny bean. You ate them hot from a paper cone, sucking the salty brine out of the shell first. Kids on 7th Avenue made them last an hour. Old men playing dominoes on the stoop made a pound last a whole afternoon. This was a taste that went back centuries to West African kitchens where groundnuts were cooked the same way. Passed down through the Atlantic, passed down through a plantation kitchen where a woman once stirred the pot with a wooden paddle, and passed down again to a Harlem stoop in 1928 where a boy named Clarence sold cones for a nickel each. Number 15, Slumgullion stretch stew. Slumgullion was the word for whatever you had. In Corin's pot, that meant a cup of leftover rice, a handful of chopped onion, 2 cold pork chops, diced small, a can of tomatoes, and a dash of hot sauce. Everything simmered together for 30 minutes until the rice swelled and the whole pot smelled like Sunday. The name was a joke. The meal was serious. A laundress with 3 boarders and 22 cents in her apron pocket could feed everyone on Slumgullion, and no one would walk away hungry. What I noticed reading old Harlem papers is how often the word turned up in women's columns. Slumgullion was code for stretching a paycheck to the next Friday. Generations of women did it. The best kind of cheap cooking there ever was. Number 14, mustard greens with Potlikker. A bundle of mustard greens at the Harlem market in 1928 cost 6 cents. A smoked ham hock cost a dime. Corrine would clean the greens in a full sink of cold water 3 times to get the grit out, because mustard greens hold dirt in every crease. She dropped them in a pot with the ham hock, 2 cups of water, and a pinch of sugar to cut the bitterness. She let them cook for an hour and a half on a low burner. The leaves collapsed. The broth at the bottom of the pot turned thick and dark and smoky. That broth had a name, Potlikker. Some cooks called it the holiest thing in a black kitchen because it carried everything the greens had to give. You poured it over cornbread. You drank it from the ladle when the pot came off the heat. A cup of Potlikker on a cold Harlem morning was better than any medicine. The doctors uptown would not have agreed, but the grandmothers knew. Potlikker carried iron, vitamin, and centuries of kitchen wisdom. When Corin's neighbor Ethel caught a fever in January of 1928, Corin brought her a covered bowl of Potlikker and a wedge of cornbread. 3 days later, Ethel was back at her typewriter at the Amsterdam News. The thing is, Potlikker was never just a broth. It was the taste of every pot of greens every black woman had ever cooked in this country. It was a ledger of salt and smoke and green leaves and the patience to wait 90 minutes for a bundle of mustards to give up their gift. When Corin passed in 1971, her daughter found the same chipped enamel pot under the kitchen sink. It still smelled like greens. 43 years of greens. That pot told the story of a century in a single smell. Number 13, catfish stew. Fresh catfish came to Harlem on the Seaboard airline trains that rolled up from Norfolk twice a week. A pound of clean catfish cost 18 cents in 1928. Corrine's husband, a porter named Walter, brought a pound home every Friday. She cut the fish into chunks, browned them in bacon fat, and simmered them with onion, diced tomato, a splash of vinegar, and a handful of boiled potatoes. The stew thickened in the pot. The fish stayed firm. The broth turned the color of a clay riverbank. Her people had cooked catfish this way on the PD River for generations. A catfish stew in Harlem was a river trip home. Number 12, chicken and dumplings. A whole chicken at the 7th Avenue Poultry Market in 1928 cost 65 cents. That was a lot of money. So chicken was Sunday food, not Tuesday food. Corrine boiled the bird slowly with an onion and a bay leaf for an hour. Then she rolled out dumplings from flour, lard, and a little of the broth, cut them into squares with a knife, and dropped them into the simmering pot. The dumplings thickened the liquor into something halfway between stew and gravy. One chicken fed 8 people, and nobody got up from the table hungry. Simple, effective. The kind of Sunday dinner that defined how a family measured time. Back then, a meal like that was a promise kept. Number 11, smothered pork chops. Corrine paid 12 cents for 2 thick bone-in pork chops at the butcher on Lenox Avenue. She dredged them in seasoned flour, browned them in a cast iron pan in bacon grease, then added a sliced onion, a spoon of flour, and a cup of water. She dropped the lid on and let the whole thing simmer on a low burner for 45 minutes until the onions went soft and the gravy turned the color of river mud. The pork came out tender enough to cut with a fork. A spoonful of that gravy over rice was supper for 4. Her aunt in Orangeburg used to say smothered meant you loved it so much you would not let it breathe. That was the kind of humor you remembered decades later. Number 10, fried apples with fatback. This was the breakfast of a porter about to work a 14-hour shift. Corrine cut 2 tart apples into thick wedges, skin and all. She fried 3 slices of fatback in a cast iron skillet until the edges went crisp, lifted them onto a plate, and dropped the apples straight into the pork drippings. A spoon of brown sugar on top. The apples softened, caramelized, and drank up the smoke. She served them beside the fatback with a hunk of biscuit. The whole plate cost under a dime, and it kept a grown man on his feet from dawn to dusk. Simple cooking, rich with history, the kind of breakfast that built the Pullman line. Number 9, stewed oxtails. Oxtails were a throwaway cut at the slaughterhouses downtown. A pound cost 8 cents. Up in Harlem, nobody treated them like trash. Corrine browned the bony joints in a heavy pot, then added carrots, onion, thyme, and enough water to cover. She let them simmer for 3 hours until the meat slid off the tail and the broth turned into a glossy dark gravy. The collagen from the bone thickened the pot into something you could almost spread on bread. A plate of oxtails over rice at a Harlem rent party in 1928 sold for 25 cents and was gone in an hour. That was some of the richest cooking ever to come out of a kitchen nobody saw. Number 8, chitlins cleaned 3 times. Chitlins are hog intestines. They arrive at your kitchen looking like nothing you would want to touch. Cleaning them takes hours. You wash them in cold water. You turn them inside out. You scrape them with a dull knife. You wash them again in vinegar water. You wash them a third time in salt water, and then you boil them with onion, red pepper, and a splash of white vinegar for 3 full hours until the house smells like a slaughterhouse and the pot finally settles into something tender and tangy and impossible to forget. In 1928, Harlem, chitlins were the centerpiece of a Saturday night rent party. A plate of chitlins with hot sauce, potato salad, and a wedge of cornbread went for $1. The pianist played stride in the front room. The neighbors crowded in. Corrine would cook 10 pounds in a night, and the pot was scraped bare by 2 in the morning. But chitlins were never just food. They were a memory of what the plantation kitchens had been forced to use. The parts of the hog that the enslavers would not eat. The cuts that black women turned into something worth paying for on a 7th Avenue stoop. Every time a pot of chitlins went on the fire, it was an act of inheritance. The recipe came up from the Low Country. The cleaning technique came from a grandmother who had learned it from her own mother, who had learned it from the great aunt who arrived in Charleston Harbor with nothing. Here is the part that surprises people. Chitlins were expensive for Corrine to make, not in money, in time. She spent 6 hours cleaning and cooking what sold for $1 a plate. She did the work because it paid the rent, but she also did the work because nobody else in that building knew how. When Hazel, the 12-year-old downstairs, asked to help one Saturday night in November of 1928, Corrine handed her a dull knife and said, "You watch first." Hazel watched. For 3 years. By 1931, she was cleaning her own. That is how a kitchen tradition survives when there's nothing to write it down on. Number 7, hog maws and onions. A hog maw is the stomach lining of a pig, another throwaway cut, another cheap centerpiece. Corrine boiled the maws for 2 hours with an onion, a bay leaf, and a tablespoon of vinegar. Then she sliced them thin, returned them to the pot with fresh onions and a pinch of red pepper, and let them simmer another 30 minutes. The texture was chewy, springy, almost like calamari. A plate of hog maws with rice was a supper for the faithful. The unfaithful never came back for a second bite. Her grandmother had served them the same way on John's Island. Some tastes simply do not translate across generations, but the people who love them deep. Number 6, shortening bread. The word shortening was Southern shorthand for shortening, meaning lard. Corrine's version was 3 cups of flour, 1 cup of lard, half a cup of sugar, and a pinch of salt. No liquid. Her fingers did the work, crumbling the lard into the flour until the whole bowl looked like wet sand. She pressed the dough into a greased skillet, cut it into squares, and baked it in a neighbor's oven for 20 minutes. It came out rich, crumbly, almost cookie-like. Children loved it. Old men dunked it in coffee. A whole pan cost maybe 12 cents and disappeared before it cooled. The old song about mama's little baby loves, shortening bread, was not fiction. It was a kitchen in Alabama, a kitchen in Georgia, a kitchen on Sugar Hill, all baking the same thing. Number 5, chicken and waffles, Harlem style. Long before Wells opened his famous supper club in 1938, chicken and waffles were already a Harlem late-night institution. Saloons on 133rd Street served the combination to musicians coming off their shift at 3 in the morning. It was breakfast and dinner at once. Corrine made her own waffles in a cast iron waffle iron held over the gas ring, 2 minutes aside, flipped by hand. She fried the chicken in a black skillet with lard and flour dredging. A plate arrived with crisp bird on top of a hot waffle with maple syrup pooling in the squares. At the Tree of Hope, a plate went for 60 cents. Corrine made it at home for 18. The musicians paid for the show. She paid for the flour. Number 4, Hoppin John on rent night. A cup of dry black-eyed peas cost 4 cents. A smoked ham hock cost a dime. A cup of rice, 2 cents. For 16 cents, Corrine fed 12 people at a rent party and still had broth left for breakfast. She soaked the peas overnight, simmered them with the hock and an onion for 2 hours, then poured the whole pot over steamed rice with a splash of the liquor on top. Every plate went for 50 cents. The rent was $32 a month. 64 plates of Hoppin John and Corn made the rent with a nickel to spare. Back then, that was the math of survival. That was the math that kept a family under a roof. Number 3, pigfoot and a pot of rice. Bessie Smith sang about a pigfoot and a bottle of beer for a reason. In 1928, a boiled pigfoot was 12 cents at any 7th Avenue lunch counter. Corrine cooked them at home in a tall pot with vinegar, hot pepper, bay leaf, and onion for 3 hours until the skin went tender and the broth went cloudy with gelatin. She served them over white rice with the cloudy broth ladled on top. The flavor was sharp, porky, tangy, and halfway between a pickle and a pot roast. A plate cost 20 cents at the bar on the corner. Corrine made it at home for 6, and it was the supper that launched 1,000 rent parties across Harlem on Friday nights when the landlord was coming Monday. Number 2, peach cobbler on a Sunday. A basket of Georgia peaches hit the Harlem stalls in July. Corrine paid 20 cents for a dozen. She peeled them, sliced them, tossed them with cane sugar and a squeeze of lemon, and poured them into a buttered dish. She rolled out a crust from flour and lard, laid it over the top, cut 3 slits with her paring knife, and slid it into a neighbor's oven for 45 minutes. The crust came out golden. The peaches underneath bubbled thick and dark and sweet. A slice of cobbler after Sunday supper was worth the whole week of laundry work. Her aunt in Macon had made it the same way. Her grandmother, before her, passed down, generation after generation, the sweetest memory a grandmother could leave behind. Number 1, Gumbo de herbes, 7 greens for luck. This is the pot that changed how Harlem ate on New Year's morning for the next 40 years. Gumbo de herbes is a Creole dish from New Orleans that traveled up the Mississippi and eventually north on the trains. The rule was you used an odd number of greens, 7 for a poor household, 9 for a better one, 11 for the richest block on the hill. Corrine used 7: mustard, turnip, collard, spinach, watercress, cabbage, and beet tops. She simmered them for 90 minutes with a ham hock and an onion. Then she chopped the whole mess fine, returned it to the broth, added a roux of flour and bacon fat, and let the pot thicken on the low burner for another hour. The gumbo was dark green, almost black, rich as anything she ever cooked. Every green carried a promise: mustard for wealth, collard for money, turnip for roots. 7 greens for 7 strangers you might meet in the coming year, each one a chance at a blessing. A bowl of gumbo herb on New Year's morning was a prayer you could eat. Corrine served it with rice and a wedge of cornbread to her 3 boarders and 2 visiting cousins on the 1st of January in 1929, the morning after the biggest rent party she ever threw. Every spoonful was a bet on the next 12 months. Every bite was an ancestor at the table. Stewed tomatoes and okra was a summer dish that started on the vine and ended in the pot the same day. In July, when both came in together, black families across the Deep South picked them at first light and had them cooking before the heat got bad. Okra's name derives from the Igbo word okwuru. It arrived in the American South through West African captives who carried seeds and knowledge of its cultivation across the Middle Passage. Combined with dead ripe tomatoes cut into rough chunks, okra's natural thickening power turned the liquid into a glossy, rich stew that needed nothing more than salt, pepper, and cornbread to soak it up. The technique mirrors traditional West African one-pot stew making, where a single vessel produced a complete meal from whatever the garden gave that day. Before the rest of the house stirred, there was tomato gravy simmering on the back burner, and you could smell the bacon fat cutting through the sharpness of canned tomatoes from under your blanket. The dish needed nothing expensive, just drippings saved in the coffee can by the stove, a tablespoon of flour stirred until it browned, and a can of stewed tomatoes crushed by hand into the skillet. A pinch of sugar took the acid down. The gravy was poured thick over white rice and eaten with a spoon, sometimes alongside fried eggs or salt pork. It came from Depression-era black kitchens where one can of tomatoes fed a household of 8, and it traveled north to Detroit and Chicago inside the memories of women who never stopped cooking it. Through the 70s, it held on as a weekday standard, the kind nobody wrote down. You made it the way your mother showed you, and if you asked for measurements, she would shake her head and say, "Pour until it looks right." By September, the overflow went into jars and came back out in January when the garden was frozen solid. The knowledge of how long to cook it, how much heat, it lives nowhere written down. But before the garden gave anything, before the beans had soaked overnight, there was Cooch-cooch, and it kept people moving when nothing else was in the house. A Senegambian dish documented in WPA slave narratives from Texas, Cooch-cooch traveled across the Atlantic in the memory of West African captives who had eaten a version of it for generations. Coarse cornmeal poured into a dry, hot iron skillet with a little lard, stirred until it browned and formed a crust, then scraped up and served with cane syrup poured over the top. The result was crispy in patches, soft underneath, sweet from the syrup, smoky from the iron, a breakfast that cost almost nothing and tasted like something worth waking early for. In the 1920s, cane syrup was the cheapest sweetener in rural Louisiana and Mississippi. Nobody makes Cooch-cooch anymore. The woman who made it every morning is not here to make it. If beans simmered all day on one burner, the other belonged to whatever the garden gave. And in late summer, nothing came sweeter than fried corn cut straight off the cob. Your grandmother held each ear upright in a wide bowl, ran a sharp knife down the rows, then went back with the dull side of the blade and scraped hard. That scraping was everything. It pulled the milky starch inside each row, and that liquid turned fried corn creamy without a drop of cream. The kernels went into bacon grease, always bacon grease, never butter, because butter burned too fast, and cooked low, stirring constantly until the corn thickened and clung to the spoon. Salt, black pepper. Some cooks added sugar if the corn was starchy, but the old women said if you needed sugar, you picked it too late. It tasted like August, hot, golden, and gone before you were ready. Poke salad was not a dish for the uninformed. The pokeweed plant grows wild across the American South, tall, purple-stemmed, with dark berries that can poison a child and leaves that will make an adult violently sick if prepared wrong. But if you know, picked young, before the toxins concentrate in the stems, boiled hard in one pot of water, that water completely poured off, covered with fresh water and boiled again, sometimes a third time. What came out was soft, slightly bitter, deeply green, then fried in a cast iron skillet with fat back until the edges crisped. The food with Roots culinary history database documents pokeweed as a traditional Southern survival food prepared by boiling multiple times to remove toxicity, a technique rooted in indigenous Southern knowledge that Black communities adapted and passed orally for generations. In the hungry stretch of late winter, poke salad stood between a family and an empty table. You did not learn this from a book. You learned it standing beside someone who knew exactly how many times the water had to change. That person is gone from most households now. Monday meant pinto beans in every black kitchen that remembered the South, and the ritual started the night before, sorting dry beans on a table, picking out the stones, leaving them to soak in cold water overnight. By morning, they were swollen. Your mother set them on a low flame with a ham hock, quartered onion, garlic, and water to cover by 2 inches. The pot stayed there all day. Monday was wash day. In New Orleans, red beans and rice on Monday was law, and beans could simmer unwatched while laundry got done on the board or hauled to the laundromat. By evening, they had broken into a thick, creamy broth that clung to cornbread. A bowl cost almost nothing and fed everyone. The woman who seasoned them knew the salt went in late because adding it early toughened the skins. She carried that timing in her hands. When she stopped cooking, Mondays never tasted the same. Money ran to nothing. Dried pinto beans were what kept families alive. In 1922, a pound cost under 5 cents, enough to feed 6 people if you started them before sunrise. You picked through them the night before, soaked them cold, then in the morning added a ham bone or fatback and a halved onion and left them alone until noon. Salt went in only at the end. Salt early made the skins tough, and a tough bean was a ruined pot. That rule was unwritten, passed by watching her fish one out and press it between her fingers to check. Sharecropper households in Mississippi and Arkansas relied on dried field peas and beans through most of the lean season, stretching a single pot across 2 days by adding water and reheating. Nobody who grew up in these kitchens forgets the smell, low and smoky and dense, filling every room before anyone else woke. Salmon croquettes were the Friday night constant in black kitchens across the South, and every city the Great Migration touched. A can of pink salmon, bones left in and crushed into the mix for calcium, a trick passed down without ever hearing the word nutrition. The salmon was flaked with a fork, folded with cracker crumbs, egg, diced onion, and black pepper. Some cooks added hot sauce, others stirred in yellow mustard, and that difference was the line between one family's recipe and another's. The patties hit a cast iron skillet of shimmering Crisco, and the sizzle was the dinner bell. You heard it from the porch. Golden and crisp outside, warm and soft in the center, they came with grits or white rice. You could follow the recipe exactly today, but without her standing over that skillet in her housecoat, flipping them with a fork she never washed between batches, they will never taste the same. Potlikker was the dark, trembling broth left in the bottom of the pot after the greens had cooked down. Collards or turnips simmered all afternoon with a ham bone. Nobody poured it out. That liquid held vitamins and minerals that nothing else on the table could match in winter. You tore cornbread and held it over the pot until it could absorb no more, then ate it standing. Chef Lachelle Cunningham, writing in the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder in 2026, called Potlikker the teacher, the nutrient-rich broth that people who didn't understand threw away. The West African tradition of saving and drinking cooking liquid crossed the ocean and landed in every black kitchen in the South. Her hands knew what to do with it. The ones who came after her, who grew up with store-bought broth and running water, mostly stopped knowing. When stewed tomatoes and okra carried a lineage stretching back to West Africa, where okra, brought to the Americas inside the hulls of slave ships, had thickened soups and stews for centuries. In black kitchens of the 1970s, it cost pennies and fed the spirit like a feast. Fresh okra was sliced into rounds and fried first in a hot skillet until the slime cooked off and the edges crisped. That step separated the cooks who knew from the ones who did not. Canned tomatoes went in next, crushed with a wooden spoon, along with onion, garlic, salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. The pot simmered until the okra was tender and the tomatoes had thickened into a sauce that was tangy, savory, and rich. Served over rice, it was a full meal. Served alongside fried fish, it was a celebration. The women who grew that okra in their backyard plots knew exactly which pods to pick, no longer than a finger because anything bigger turned woody. She put them right in the ashes, not near the fire, directly in the gray-white coals that pulsed after the wood burned down. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes were documented in WPA Federal Writers Project narratives. Betty Curlett of Arkansas told interviewers she roasted potatoes on hot ashes in a wash pot, a technique rooted in West and Central African open fire cooking, where food placed directly on coals sealed inside its own moisture. No pan, no rack, no oven, just ash cooled to the right point and the judgment to know the difference. After 45 minutes, the skin came off in your hands, charred and paper thin, and the flesh was dense and sweet in a way no oven-baked version ever matched, caramelized from the inside out by heat coming from every direction. The children who watched her do it grew up and couldn't explain how she always knew when they were ready. She never checked them more than once. She kept them in a bag in the freezer, yellow and curled, and when you were young, they frightened you. But your grandmother saw something in chicken feet the grocery store did not. Collagen, gelatin, a broth so rich it set like jelly when it cooled. The feet were scrubbed, outer skin peeled after a blanch, nails clipped with kitchen shears, into the pot with onion, celery, garlic, and bay leaves. Hours later, the liquor had turned golden and thick, the feet broken down until tiny bones pulled from tender meat. In the Caribbean and across West Africa, chicken foot soup was healing food, given to the sick and the newly delivered mother. Black families in the South carried that belief into the 1970s. When supermarkets replaced corner butcher shops, the stew disappeared from most kitchens. The women who made it swore the broth could fix anything. They are gone now. Nobody has found a replacement. Guinea hens ran loose in yards across the rural Black South, and anyone who kept them knew they weren't pets. They were the insurance policy. Soul food historians document that enslaved people of West Central African origin cooked guinea fowl with rice exactly as their forebears had. The bird jointed and browned hard in iron, then covered with water and root vegetables and pulled to a long, low simmer. Into the 1920s, Black households still stewed guinea hen the old way. Onion, turnip, sweet potato in the pot, 2 hours low until the meat left the bone. The broth had a richness chicken couldn't match. Darker, more complex, telling you plainly that this bird had lived outside, had eaten bugs and grass, and moved under its own power. That broth poured over rice, and the bowl came back to the pot for more. Dirty rice earned its name from how it looked, flecked brown and gray from chopped chicken livers and gizzards stirred through every grain. And anyone from a Louisiana kitchen knew the dish by sight before they tasted it. The livers were sautéed fast until firm but still pink, then chopped fine alongside gizzards, simmered tender for an hour. The Holy Trinity, onion, celery, bell pepper, went in next, diced small and cooked in rendered fat until soft. Cooked rice was folded in with green onion, garlic, cayenne, and a splash of Worcestershire nobody measured. By the 70s, dirty rice showed up at reunions, holiday tables, and Friday suppers alongside fried fish. It was never the centerpiece and did not need to be. It made everything else on the plate make sense, and the cook who got the seasoning right never had to ask if people liked it. The empty pot answered. Corrine Whitfield's kitchen on Sugar Hill is still there. The brownstone still stands at the corner, but the coal scuttle is gone. The gas range is gone. Today, a tech worker rents that same apartment for $4,200 a month. He eats $8 avocado toast on his way to the subway. He has never boiled a pig foot. He has never tasted Potlikker. Corrine fed 5 people a day on 22 cents. Today, 5 people in that kitchen would cost $150, and everybody would still go home hungry for something that is not on any menu.